pop 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 pop. It was only 9:45 p.m. and the local kids were already setting off cherry bombs. Lydia expected such, but even so, it startled her to the point of spilling the tea she held in her hand. The hot liquid burned the inside of her thigh, and she cursed under breath. It was New Year's Eve, and Lydia was spending it the way she always had, alone, curled up with a good book and a hot beverage. The holiday was just another day for her, and although she did make it a tradition to at least stay up until midnight, she felt no need to spend it with friends or family. She liked the solitude, and often felt awkward around other people. Getting up to wash the tea from her leg, she passed the once vibrant Christmas tree whose lights were no longer twinkling. The last time the lights were on was Christmas Day. She made a mental note to take it down the following morning, as well as all the other half-assed decorations she had around her house. She often wondered why she bothered putting them up anyway. Nobody saw them but her, but old habits die hard. Grabbing a rag from a drawer in the kitchen, she wiped off the spilled tea and examined her thigh. The spot was red, but nothing too serious. The pain would subside quickly, and as long as she kept a firm grip on her mug, she was sure she would be able to get through the night without too many serious injuries, fireworks or not. Just then, the phone rang. Forgetting about the burn and figuring one of her family members was calling to wish her a Happy New Year, she answered. "Hello?" She heard laughing in the background, but nobody replied. "Hello?" she asked again, a little louder. "Is Joseph there?" It was a woman's voice. Lydia could still hear laughing in the background. "I'm sorry, there's no Joseph here. You must have the wrong number." Then the person on the other end hung up. Lydia took the phone from her ear and made a flabbergasted facial expression. "That was rude," she said, and placed the phone back on the receiver. As she made her way back into the living room, she heard laughing coming from the front of the house. Immediately reminded of the phone call she just received, Lydia froze to listen. More laughing, and getting louder. She made her way to her front window and peeked outside. To her relief, a group of teenagers were walking up the sidewalk, sparklers in their hands, laughing up a storm, the boys teasing the girls and the girls giggling their heads off. The street lamps made their shadows bouncy and elongated, reminding Lydia of the shadows she used to see when the power would go out and her family had to rely on candlelight. One of the girls pushed one of the boys gently, knocking him off the sidewalk and onto the street. "You're gonna get it now," he shouted, and the girl tried to hide behind one of her friends. Lydia let go of the breath she was holding and closed the curtain. She did not miss being a teenager, although a small part of her felt nostalgic at the thought of interacting with the opposite sex. There was nothing like those first-time butterflies, casual glances, and playful teasing. Smiling to herself, she returned to the couch, sipped her tea and began reading her book again. About an hour passed before the phone rang again. Thinking for sure it would be one of her relatives this time, she got up and answered. "Hello?" Again, nobody answered, but she could hear what seemed to sound like a party in the background. She could hear glasses clinking together, music playing in the distance, loud conversation, and the occasional noisemaker going off. "Hello?" she asked again, louder still. Then she heard what sounded to be someone shuffling the phone about and then nothing. The dial tone was the only thing she could hear now, so she hung up again. "What the hell?" she asked to herself. Aside from the first phone call she received, Lydia figured someone had accidentally butt-dialed her. Letting it go, she returned to the couch. As midnight approached, Lydia grew increasingly tired, but was determined to stay awake. As she read sentence after sentence, her eyelids felt like they were filling with sand, and she would catch herself closing them for a few seconds. She looked at the clock. It was 11:45. 15 more minutes, then I can finally turn in, she said, closing her book and searching for the television remote. Lydia figured the TV would be the perfect distraction as she waited for midnight. Then, the phone rang again. Lydia contemplated answering it. It wasn't usual for her to get any calls period, let alone 3 in a few hours, wrong numbers or not. Curiosity got the best of her, however, and she walked over to the receiver. "Hello?" she asked, in an irritated voice. Honk. A loud noisemaker blasted in Lydia's ear. She moved the phone away from her head as quickly as she would have if she touched a hot stove. A man's voice appeared, and he spoke no louder than an angry whisper. "Happy New Year, Joseph. You never thought I'd do it, but I will." The man laughed, and breathed in deeply. "Do you like when things burn, Joseph? They'll try to stop me, but I'll do it. It will be beautiful." Lydia's brow furrowed. Not knowing how to respond, she said, "Who is this? There is no Joseph here." The man on the other end kept his tone to a whisper and said only one more thing before hanging up. "You'll burn, too." A woman laughed in the background, and then silence. Lydia slammed the phone down into the receiver. A chill ran up her spine and she looked at the clock. It was almost midnight, but she couldn't focus on New Year's when she was shaken to the core. Without really knowing what to do next, Lydia decided to check all the doors to make sure they were locked and all the blinds to make sure they were closed. Her anxiety rose every time a new firecracker went off in the distance, and she kept having to tell herself that it was nothing but kids horsing around and enjoying the holiday. When 11:59 rolled around, Lydia crept back onto the couch and huddled underneath a blanket. She braced herself for the impending firecrackers, and when the clock struck 12 o'clock, she closed her eyes. Several firecrackers and fireworks erupted in the distance, sounding like a mixture of gunfire and explosions. She jumped at every one, holding her breath between every pop and snap, closing her eyes and counting the minutes when it would all be over. The main hoopla subsided around 12:30. Although she was still shaken up from the prank phone call, if that's what it even was, she decided she would turn off her ringer and go to sleep. Her heart had had enough action for the night, and all she wanted to do was close her eyes and drift off into a land of nothingness for a few hours. As her hand went for the ringer off button on her phone, it rang once again. Hesitant to pick it up, yet too curious to leave it ringing, she answered the phone for a fourth time. "Yes?" she asked with a whisper. It was the same man as before, whispering violently. "Are you ready, Joseph? I can feel the heat already. It's moving through my veins and warming the soul that will soon be damned. Oh, Joseph. The time is now." Then what sounded like a loud air horn went off into the phone, and Lydia dropped it to the ground. She could still hear it going off when she picked it up again and slammed it into the receiver. Turning off the ringer, she ran into the back bedroom, shut the door, and jumped onto her bed. She could still hear firecrackers in the distance, but eventually her heart slowed and she was able to lie down. She wasn't able to fall asleep until around 2 a.m., but she did eventually drift off into that land of nothingness. "I'm here, Joseph. It's happening." Lydia's eyes fluttered open to the sound of a man talking and the smell of smoke. Startled awake, she found she was lying on her bathroom floor with the door closed. She was unable to process how she got there because panic took over her body. "It's going to be so beautiful, and you won't be able to stop me." A woman giggled, and then Lydia heard what sounded like scratching on the door. She suddenly felt like she was being pressed to death, unable to get up or do anything because the fear she felt was so strong. After a few seconds, she recognized the voices as the ones she heard on the phone earlier. Lydia heard a loud bang as if something large had been dropped outside the door, and she jumped, tears beginning to stream down her face. Too scared to do anything, she put her hands to her mouth and waited to see if anything else would happen, all the while, the smell of smoke getting stronger. Lydia felt her stomach drop. More scratching up and down her door, and then the man whispering again. "It's gonna burn. It's gonna burn." Whoever was on the other side of the door suddenly ran out of the room, so Lydia jumped up and tried the door. Jammed. Something was blocking it from the outside, just as she expected. Lydia pressed her ear against the door and listened. From the distance, she heard the man and woman laughing. "It's getting hot. The flames are spreading," the man screamed. Putting two and two together, Lydia figured the people in her home were going to burn the house down, with her in it. Looking up at the only other way out, her heart sank. There was no way she would be able to fit through the tiny bathroom window. "Let me out!" Lydia screamed, hoping against hope someone would open the door. The only response she heard was more laughter. In the distance, she heard glass break. Lydia tried the knob again, and found that it was becoming warm. "Whoever you are, please let me out. I'll give you anything you want, just please let me out of here." Silence. She pressed her face against the door and felt a slight heat. She turned and faced the mirror, almost not recognizing herself because the terror in her face made her look completely different. "I'm going to die," she thought. What a great way to start off the new year. Lydia leaped to her feet and grabbed the toilet tank lid. Without thinking of anything else, she started hitting it against the doorknob, hoping she could somehow break the door open. Smoke started coming through under the door, and Lydia started pounding faster. With every hit, Lydia let out a desperate cry. After a few minutes, Lydia thought she wasn't going to be able to do it, but with one final smack, the doorknob fell to the ground. Lydia pushed the door with all her strength, but it was futile. Whatever those people pushed in front of the door, it was not going anywhere. In a fit of rage, Lydia slammed the palms of both her hands into the door over and over, screaming until she started coughing. The smoke and heat coming into the bathroom was beginning to become too much. With resignation, Lydia sank to the floor. Her eyes began to sting and it was getting too hard to breathe. She was becoming lightheaded. She looked over to the small bathroom window and thought I could have at least opened it and screamed for help. She closed her eyes, heat enveloping her body. Her final thought before passing out was, "Who the fuck is Joseph? I hope he had a better New Year's Eve than I did." It took 8 minutes for the fire department to respond, but by then it was too late. Credit to Aya, and it was too late. Credit to Aya, and it was first it was the gays. Then the Muslims. Then the terrorists. Then the gay terrorist Muslims. I don't know. It's hard to keep track of who you're meant to be hating when you're a straight, white male. I put that as my Facebook status once. 34 likes. I felt like kind of a big deal. In a world so oversaturated with attention addicts, I don't see the issue with indulging in the odd hit of pure, uncut validation once in a while. It's a good rush. There was a time when I thought the whole idea of social networking was juvenile. I saw every tweet, blog entry and status update as a child hanging from the monkey bars shouting at their mother for not looking. I'm not above that. No one is above that. Grow up. What does that even mean? At what age are you meant to stop enjoying positive reinforcements? Is growing up synonymous with being a jaded cynic? Forget that. Validate me. I'm going to be dead one day. Tell me that my observations are witty and relevant. Retweet me. Reblog me. I walk through crowds, tangent and clothed, yet invisible and unimportant. Just like the rest of you. Some of you peacock to get a second glance. A real-life Facebook like. Let's all peacock and blend in together, right? 7 retweets, 26 likes. No one will remember your name. They will all remember mine. I catch the 5:15 train home and rarely get a seat. The train ride home is the only time it is socially acceptable to grind on strangers. 5 retweets, 17 Facebook likes. I return home from work at around 5:45 every weekday, lock the front door, finish the last of my commutable cappuccino and place the cup in the recycling bin. I remove my tie and drape it over the coat hanger on my living room door. I undo the top button of my $8.99 shirt and breathe a sigh of relief that the working day is done. I pull my iPhone from my pocket and scroll absently for around 5 minutes and then I head to the basement. It's quite a nice basement. It's spacious and insulated. The floor is laminated and kept clean and the walls are decorated with art prints and watercolor canvases. I paint some of them. Check out my Instagram when all of this is over, maybe you'll like them. The smell isn't great down there sometimes but that's a means to an end. I can deal with the smell. Soundproofing. That's the important part. After entering my basement, I turned right and head to the far wall. There will always be two objects of interest that I approach. One of them will usually be moving, the other one silent. With my iPhone still in hand, I open the camera and hold it landscape, tapping the screen to gain focus. I take several shots just to make sure that I get a good one, and then I lock the screen again. The one that moves usually begs me to let them go. They bargain and they plead. Sometimes they come on to me. I gesture to the silent and still one tied up next to them. I pull out the swollen, black tongue and turn the gaunt, lifeless face towards them and remind them what they are. All that they are. It doesn't matter how many followers you have on Twitter when you're tied to a radiator in my basement. 12 red wheats. I wish I could see their faces when they find out. I make the live one watch as I fill the small bathtub in the corner with lye. I make them watch as I untie the dead one and drag them over to the tub and slide them in. I then leave the two of them together overnight. By the morning, all that's left is a brownish, black sludge and a few brittle bones. It's always too much for the live one to stomach. I tell them again, it's all that they are. Sex, gender, race, religion, whatever. They all look the same after a night in my tub. I have been documenting the whole thing from the start. Just a few more and my blog can go live. I don't know what to call it yet. Social macabre? Maybe? I don't know. I'm going to be critical of whatever name I choose. Either way, once I share it, the internet is going to explode. I'll be viral. A social media pandemic infecting the feeds and personal profiles of people all over the world. They'll forget the names of my art pieces, but they will remember my name. I might even get my own hashtag. Credit to Radarshine. You're making a mistake. I'm sorry you feel that way, Mr. Monahan. Our decision has been made. But there's nothing more to be said. Your final check will be in the mail tomorrow. Molly and I thank you for your services. Click. Jack Monahan sat behind the desk in the dingy room that served as his office, staring at the now silent receiver held in his hand as if willing the voice at the other end to come back. After a few moments, the phone started beeping, letting him know it was still off the hook. Jack resisted a strong urge to bash the thing to pieces against his desk and instead ever so carefully placed the receiver back on the cradle with a resounding click of its own. The sound echoed hollowly throughout the room, perfectly mirroring the empty feeling that had suddenly appeared in his gut. Damn it, he'd been so close. His right hand, almost of its own accord, reached down to the drawer where he kept a bottle of cheap bourbon, half empty and soon to be more so, and a glass that was only slightly dirty. He set the two next to each other on the desk and, after a moment's consideration, returned the glass to the drawer. He removed the top from the bottle and took a long swallow. A slow burning sensation traveling from his belly up to the base of his throat drove the empty feeling back ever so slightly. Jack sighed. Drunk or no, either way this was going to be a bad night. The case had been about kids, but for Jack it had started with just one. June Benson, 8-year-old daughter of Chase and Molly Benson, had gone missing after school one day about 3 weeks ago. Her parents were decently well off, but no ransom or other demands had ever come. The cops asked some questions at the school, filed some paperwork, and ultimately ruled her as a runaway. The Bensons weren't satisfied with that assessment and had hired Jack to follow up where the uniforms wouldn't. Jack agreed with them that something smelled off. A little digging showed the rabbit hole went down a hell of a lot deeper than June Benson. Carefully applying some financial lubrication, Jack got one of his old contacts in the department to spill the beans. There were a lot of kids that had gone missing in the last 2 months, almost 3 dozen all told. Part of the reason for the general lack of panic was that most of the kids were low income, if not outright homeless. On top of that, Jack's contact heavily hinted that there was pressure from a very long way up the food chain to keep a lid on the cases and sweep each and every one of them under the rug. That thing that smelled off started to stink like a fish market. Jack hit the streets. He went to June's school and the surrounding apartments. Then, Finding nothing, he rolled up his sleeves and waded into the scum on the other side of the city. He canvassed the halfway houses, the tent city under Eastbrook Bridge, the Wakeside slum where cops would only go in force. Everywhere he went he asked the same questions. Has anyone seen anything? Does anyone know about these missing kids? For a week he was disappointed, until finally, he got a bite. The informant was obviously a junkie, and was even more obviously looking for a fix. But he said he'd seen something, namely two goons in suits shoving a black bag over a young boy's head and throwing him into an unmarked van outside a crack house the junkie had been flopping at. What's more, and what earned him the $20 in Jack's outstretched hand, was he'd heard one of the goons say a name, Marks. Suddenly the pieces had begun falling into place. Graydon Marks was the owner of a pharmaceutical subsidiary that kept a production plant outside of town. It made a sick kind of sense that Marks might have decided to take kids as unwilling, unpaid subjects for new drugs they were testing, and he was one of the only individuals with both enough political and monetary pull to keep the mayor's office and police department on lockdown. Granted, it was a long shot, and June didn't fit the profile of the rest of the missing kids, but Jack had been desperate to find even the thinnest thread to follow. The plant lay on a sprawling property outside of the city limits where Marks kept a house that served as his primary residence when he was in town. Jack had been surreptitiously staking the place out for the last 3 days and had seen several unmarked vans driven by pairs of suit-wearing toughs coming and going from the main entrance of the compound. He'd planned on taking a closer look tonight. But then, when he'd been at the office getting ready to head over to the plant, Chase had called him out of the blue and said, "Thanks, but they wouldn't be needing him to keep looking into June's disappearance after all." End of discussion. Jack leaned back in his chair and looked into the bottle, pensively swirling the bourbon around the bottom. Fuck it. He came to the decision abruptly, standing up and slamming the bottle down onto the desktop. He hadn't known the Bensons for long, but this was completely out of character. Something was up and, damn it, there were kids at risk. He might not be getting paid to follow up the lead, but Jack's conscience wasn't going to let him just sit and get wasted. He took his overcoat from the back of the chair and threw it on before reaching into the other drawer where he kept Cheryl. The Colt .357 was a thing of beauty, and he did a quick check to make sure each of her 6 cartridges were loaded before sliding her into his shoulder holster and slipping a box of spare shells into his jacket pocket. With that he stepped out into the hallway and resolutely locked the door behind him. Dark clouds covered the pale winter moon as Jack moved the car to the side of the road and pulled into a small clearing he had discovered earlier in the week. He got out and hastily removed a tarp from the back seat and threw it over the car. In the dark, the vehicle would be effectively invisible to anyone on the road. It had been steadily snowing for the last few hours, so he briefly went back to the road and did his best to cover the tracks leading into the clearing. He had stopped about a mile short of the entrance to the compound, with only one road leading in or out and no other turnoffs. Getting too close wouldn't serve for any kind of sneaking. The approach to the plant was thick with trees, so Jack would be able to stay in the woods but keep in sight of the road to guide his path. Wrapping his coat more tightly about himself against the cold, he started trudging towards the compound. A strange moaning caused him to start, his hand flying under his coat to rest on Cheryl. Jack scanned around him, heart beating wildly. The trees in their stark nakedness reached into the bleak sky like the fingers of the damned, a light wind causing them to creak and groan in their torment. Otherwise, all was silent. Despite the cold, a slow bead of sweat rolled down Jack's nose, the tiny hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. After a few moments he turned and continued his trek, his hand remained on the butt of the revolver. He reached the perimeter fence without incident. He had scouted the area and found an expanse of fence where the trees masked the view of the security cameras and was out of sight of the main gate. Earlier today he had used a pair of wire cutters to make an entrance. Slightly winded as he squeezed through the fence, days like this served to remind him that his youth was a distant memory. Jack cursed under his breath as he felt sharp edges of wire catch onto his coat. Then he was in. Jack's reconnaissance hadn't let him work out the patrol patterns of any security guards, but now he saw he needn't have worried too much. In fact, other than the guards in the shack at the main gate, there didn't seem to be any physical security on the grounds. He decided to start looking at the house. Making his way across the snowy terrain, Jack saw the residence atop a low hill a couple hundred yards ahead, light glaring from every window. He crept closer, doing his best to use the trees that dotted the yard to mask his approach. He stopped behind the closest tree and was considering how to proceed when the front door opened and three figures stepped outside. The first Jack knew only by reputation, but the oily sheen that emitted from his too wide smile identified him as Graydon Marks. Jack's jaw dropped when he saw the people behind Marks were Chase and Molly Benson. Jack was just close enough to hear the end of their conversation. "And can we see her, Mr. Marks?" "Oh, presently my dear, Chase. In fact, that's where we're going now. Come along." The millionaire switched on a large industrial flashlight and led the Bensons around behind the house. Jack followed, silent as a shadow. At first Jack assumed they would be going to the pharmaceutical plant to the west of the house, but soon found he was mistaken. Instead, Marks walked directly south, straight into woods that were even thicker than those through which Jack had approached the compound. They walked for maybe 20 minutes, Jack struggling to stay quiet and keep the bouncing beam of Marks's flashlight in sight. After a time he could see a strange flickering ahead which, once they got close enough, he could identify as a roaring bonfire set in a small clearing. He stopped about 50 feet short of the fire and hid himself behind a tree. He could see the Bensons were agitated, Molly clinging to her husband, Chase obviously enraged, shouting at Marks. "What's the meaning of this, Marks? You said you were taking us to see our daughter." "And so I have, Chase, so I have. She'll be here shortly. The fire, you see. We've found it draws them." The millionaire smiled and moved to a tree at the edge of the clearing. In a smooth motion he hoisted himself up into a hunting platform set on the lower branches. "Ah, here she is now." The pale shape of a little girl moved into the clearing. Jack recognized June from the pictures her parents had given him, but only just. Her once sparkling eyes were dull and empty, lacking even the most rudimentary intelligence, her face slack, a dried reddish smear crusted around her mouth. The girl was dressed in rags, her hands and feet bare. She shuffled forward, almost stumbling into the fire, paying no mind to her parents or the heat. Something was very wrong. "Oh, my God. Baby." Molly Benson threw herself at her child, sweeping her up in a hug. Jack saw a look of ecstasy pass across the girl's face and a sudden, terrible hunger entered her eyes before she suddenly opened her mouth and sank her teeth into her mother's neck. Molly screamed and Chase lunged for his wife as a fountain of blood erupted from her neck, washing June's face in gore. The girl rode her mother to the ground, worrying at the wound like a wild animal. Jack felt the world lurch. Chase was struggling to pry June off Molly when Jack saw other small shapes had entered the clearing. Chase didn't notice until the things that had once been children were practically on top of him, and by then it was far too late. Jack turned and ran. He sprinted through the forest, mindless now of the noise he was making, his only thought on escape. Branches reached out and tried to tangle his arms, stones sought to trip him up. Abruptly a root caught his foot and sent him tumbling head over heels. His head met a tree with a sickening thud. Then, blackness. When he awoke, the first thing he noticed was the pain, next the cold. Shaking his head to try to clear it, Jack looked around. He had been stripped down to his t-shirt and boxers, his hands secured with rope to the trunk of a tree above his head. To his front, Marks stood in the clearing, the bonfire burning merrily behind him, two piles of rapidly cooling red and flesh-colored pulp pouring steam into the frosty air at his feet. He held Cheryl in his hands, the revolver glinting cruelly in the firelight. "Ah, Mr. Monahan, good you're awake," he smiled. "You have my admiration. Excellent detective work these past few weeks, if not the most discreet." He clicked his tongue. "I hope you didn't think you were being especially sneaky." He sighed. Still, it would have gone easier for you if you would have just taken the hint when I had the pensions let you go. They were so frantic at the thought of being reunited with their daughter, they were fully prepared to do any little thing I asked. But here we are. I must say, this is truly an excellent firearm. He admired the Magnum for another moment before pointing it at Jack and pulling the trigger. The sound was enormous. A blossom of agony roared up Jack's leg and then dulled. When he opened his eyes he saw the shattered ruin that had once been his right foot. Marx stooped down in front of him. Must be going, old chap. I'd tell you to simply walk away from this, but you've squandered that opportunity already and, well, it'd be quite impossible now for a multitude of reasons. He inclined his head towards Jack's destroyed foot. However, as I've confessed my admiration, I've decided to give you a sporting chance. There's a very realistic possibility you'll bleed out before the children get hungry again. Good luck. With that he walked out of the clearing into the darkened woods. Jack lay there in the snow, the white around him slowly turning red. His eyesight fading, the dull pain that had been emitting from his foot gradually built to a crescendo. At the edge of his vision, he could just make out a small shape enter the clearing and slowly shuffle towards him, soon followed by another. He began slipping into unconsciousness as he felt the first tiny, questing hands start to explore his exposed, freezing flesh. His last thought before his entire world was consumed by blackness and pain was that he guessed he'd been right at the office after all. Either way, this was going to be a bad night. Credit to Shadows Wimmer 77. Credit to Shadows Wimmer 77. Credit to, the first thing I always remember is the heat. Even when I could see nothing, hear nothing, even when my brain was trying to bury itself in the comfy, dark recesses of unconsciousness, my body was slowly being cooked sunny side down. I couldn't open my eyes, but I didn't want to anyway. I was tired, I had been unconscious, the heat was tolerable when I was asleep, and I really wanted to go back to sleep, like a tired kid burying his head into the pillow moaning I don't want to go to school. My body however was slowly waking up on its own. I began to grow conscious of other stimuli, the light-away cotton green uniform, the heavy combat boots, the open-ended gloves that protected my palms but left my fingers to saute on the melted asphalt. Something was missing though. Finally, I slowly opened my eyes, and the light and heat quickly slammed the doors again. I tried again after several minutes, but slower this time, and this time it was bearable. I was laying on something hot, a stretch of rough, black surface turned into a warped, bubbly skillet by heat. Some of it stuck to the black, pocketed vest that covered my torso, to the knee pads, and the toes of my boots. As my vision cleared further, I noticed more and more of the area beyond the black road. Dust swirled about me in dust devils. The heat was not just coming from the ground, the wind was like a dragon's breath, and it smelled of something burning. A bit of everything burning. Then came the pain. I say the pain because there was no one area of it. I felt as if I had been run over by a steamroller from head to foot. My hands were charred from lying on the ground. My body was a little better off, protected from direct heat by a couple layers of cotton and tactical vest pockets, but my skin was drenched with sweat, the inside of my clothes was a swamp. And my head. Oh, Jesus Christ, my head. Only way to describe it is to imagine your head being put in a maraca with 10 pounds of buckshot lead, and going to Mexican New Year celebrations. It was terrible, and I wasn't even moving yet. There seemed to be a big blackness on the right side of my vision. It came to me that I had only been seeing out of my left eye, the right side had not opened. Or it wasn't there. I realized now that little could be done lying on my face like a dead turtle, so I decided to attempt rolling onto my back, and getting a somewhat better look about me. I knew already that this was going to hurt. Some of the melted asphalt had cooled with my face touching it. It would be like ripping off duct tape. Only a lot worse. I prepared for blood, knowing that the oily tar would not come off on its own, and I could not lie here on my face all day. At first my arms didn't seem to work, just laying there like dry docked eels. Then, as they got more blood in them, the pain flowed in. They felt like they had been stretched, balled up, jackhammered, then mixed with water and spread out alongside the asphalt. However, my arms are rather muscular and recovered quickly. Planting my hands against the ground, my elbows reaching above my spine like a spider's legs, I braced for the pain, and pushed, arching my spine. At first my face resisted parting with the ground, and the pulling my skin caused a sharp discomfort. This was bliss compared with what happened next. Setting my neck and jaw, I yanked my head backwards and pushed up. There was a most nasty peeling noise, like the pulling apart of two pieces of meat, which is not too far off, a tear or two, and warm, red blood began to spurt onto the smoking tart. My face seized up from the utter agony of several layers of my skin being yanked off. It made me glad I hadn't grown a beard or long hair. I might have lost my whole face. At least I was able to move, but the pain was making my vision flutter. Stabilizing myself, I rocked myself backwards, so I was kneeling upright. Now the steady tide of blood streaked down my neck to soak into my thick, green spattered coat. I knew now that before I could look around I needed to find something to cover the wound. Something was falling out of the sky into my hair, building up on my shoulders and gear. It looked like dirty snow. Whatever it was, I needed to clean and dress my disfigured cheek immediately. I looked around me for some spare cloth, a medkit or a backpack. I had a large backpack on my shoulders. It matched my forest pattern uniform, probably my helmet too. Wherever that thing was. It was held across my chest by several buckles to keep it on my back, so I proceeded to undo them. I then noticed a name tag on the left shoulder strap. Specialist 4, Austin Carver. It wasn't a name I recognized. My fingers were so blistered and sore it was slow and hellish undoing the 3 clasps, but click by click I was able to shrug the gear off. It fell with a thud into the dust, and I felt lighter, the strain on my back lessened. A couple more clamps and it lay open like a little cave. It was chock full of gear. Pouches on the outside held a canteen filled with lukewarm water, a couple tube-like grenades, more ammunition for my rifle, which also seemed to be missing like most of my hardware, and a radio, but the materials inside were enough for 3 men, and it was all mine. I quickly found ample medical supplies in a small red box. More pain was to come. I would have to dab some disinfectant onto my cheek before I patched it up. I stared at the dreaded brown bottle of hydrogen peroxide before gritting my teeth, biting down on a piece of gauze before applying some to a cloth. I poised it over my cheek, bit the bullet, and pressed it to my face. Some pain is so bad it makes you lose control of some other parts of your body. I felt my fingers numb a bit and shake like an electrical current was going through them, but my jaw dropped into a soundless scream as my face squeezed tight. Through it all the offending cloth stayed over the wound. Finally, satisfied that the disinfectant had done its work, I threw the blood-stained item as far from me as possible, gasping for breath, and grabbed a clean gauze, folded it into a wad, and taped it onto the wound. Before sweat and blood could remove the adhesive, I wrapped a bandage around my head, encompassing my mouth, ears, and the back of my head. I can only imagine it looked like makeshift balaclava for someone in a mental institution, especially when I had to cut a hole for my mouth to breathe through. Then I remembered my right eye. When applying the bandage I had felt a scaly surface over the right side of my head, along with an acute pain. Feeling it again, I rubbed it with my finger, and it came off dusted with something like rust. Dried blood. Somehow my head had been injured and blood had poured over my eye and hardened like a seal of wax. Taking a little more cloth, I dampened it with water and rubbed at my eye. It came away red, but soon my right eye was opened. Then I turned my attention to my aforementioned head wound. Gingerly my hand crept up my skull to the nexus of pain jolts. Suddenly I found the problem. It was as if my hand were a car and it had suddenly driven off a cliff. A massive dent, more like a bomb crater, shaped like a spearhead running about 4 inches along the dome of my head. It was no wonder I wasn't remembering much, there was serious damage up there. My stomach rumbled most audibly, and it felt shrunken. I patted my belly, and noticed that there were some ribs showing. Before I shouldered the pack again, I found some containers near the bottom of the bag, reading case for MRE. Were I in a more comfortable situation, I'm sure the rations inside would have been left where they were, but as I inhaled the food quicker than you would think possible. More of the dirty snow was falling as I shouldered my gear again, pushing my curiosity more. I needed to examine the environment beyond where I was. At the moment, I had slowly pieced together my surroundings. I seemed to be in a large hole, a foxhole perhaps, but there was asphalt at the bottom. My thought was that maybe an earthquake had caused this part of the road to fall several feet into a fault. The sides were a steep mix of gravel, sand, and several huge fragments of metal beams. I could climb out, but it would be on all fours. Now that all my immediate issues had been cared for, it hit me like a thunderbolt, so sudden and profound that I nearly rocked back on my heels. Who am I? I hadn't recognized the name tag. Was it my own name? How did I get here? What's been happening? 1,000 questions swarmed through my head so fast my knees buckled, and I ended up back where I had started 10 minutes ago. Suddenly the slopes of the crater I was in became like walls, and they began to close in. A deep-seated panic set in and my heart began to race. Blood oozed through my cheek and down my forehead as I clawed into the sand, hiding me from the rest of the world. I dug in my toes, and climbed furiously up the slope. Then, like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water, I emerged from the hole, gasping for air. I lay prone on the lip of the crater for a minute, my stress-induced claustrophobia bleeding away with all my head wounds. My hand gripped the scorched sand like a lifeline. My head slowly came up again. I felt serious déjà vu from an hour ago when I had awoken in the crater. Mostly because I, again, was lying my face, feeling like death. And, looking up, the area I had now discovered was not much different from the smoking hole from which I had emerged. It was larger, more open, and set on a softly sloped hillside leading to a peak. A road ran the length of it, disappearing over the top. Many structures lined both sides of the road, a lot of them on fire, some of them unrecognizable, reduced to splintered wood, crushed plaster and scattered tiles. Everything had been sprawled in one direction, like a huge sledgehammer had hit the block and sent everything flying. What an ungodly mess. Some cars were lying on their backs like dead spiders, some twisted or smelted into shapeless masses of steel and rubber. License plates had melted and cooled into shiny green-stained icicles on the rear ends of the now-dead machines. I tried to crawl forward, but a tinkling noise and a sharp pain in my fingertips forced me to stop again. Shattered glass carpeted the ground in every direction, you could spit and not miss a shard. Now blood oozed from my fingers, and I was forced to dig into the bag again, fresh warm blood smearing the green material. Soon my hands matched my rather grotesque head bandage. I must have looked quite a sight, my charred green uniform, all my gear, and then these blaring white bandages smeared with red stains turning a deep rusty brown. I stood up this time, very shakily, to save my fingers more damage and to let my tough boots deal with the glass. Now my head was brushing against a layer of smoke that was flowing parallel to the spread of wreckage that encompassed me. I became conscious of the smell again, only now it was much stronger, a witch's cauldron of pongs. I could not find one word for it. The clouds split for a moment, and the light poured onto the smoldering landscape. Something shone into my dazed right eye, which was still adjusting, and I raised my bandaged hands to ease the flash. The sun was reflecting off a large piece of shiny metal, flat, protected from damage by a pile of rubble. It caught my attention firmly, and I felt the irrepressible need to investigate it, to touch it. I stumbled across the street, not bothering to look both ways. It hardly seemed the time to worry about the old common courtesies of times that seemed to have changed dramatically. I stood over the pile of concrete crumbles and jagged miniature palisades of steel rebar, carefully putting one foot in front of the other in my little quest. While I shambled gently like a colt taking its first steps, my eyes took in thousands of images from the endless stimuli of this foreign-seeming landscape. The cars all looked like corpses, some of them were burned to charcoal. Once charming houses making up a suburb now were piles of splinters and glass shards, like the cremated remains of the dead tossed to the wind. I finally reached the pile of wreckage underneath which the piece of metal shone like a beacon. I now saw it lay beneath an gutted couch, with bits of stuffing catching in the wind like cottonwood seeds. I even saw some broken picture frames, empty, shattered reminders of a healthy, safe world long gone, bulldozed by an unforeseen event. The metal was now within my reach, and I grabbed it with both hands, pulling with my back, legs and shoulders. Even with the glove protecting my palms, I could feel the heat of the metal on my exposed fingers, like a cookie sheet taken out of the oven. A screeching of concrete scraping steel, and I felt it slowly releasing, bit by bit, for it was huge, about the size of a plane's wing. It was bent into the shape of a dinner plate by the rubble that imprisoned it. It was battered into a surprisingly fetching mix of silver scrapes and turquoise splashes. I now could see what it was, one of those signs in a city that directs you somewhere. It was upside down, and a lot of the lettering had been battered away, so I couldn't read it yet. Oh, how I wanted to read it. Now I could feel the pain in my muscles, my shoulders especially. It just seemed to keep feeding itself out like a scroll. Finally, after having dragged nearly 10 feet of metal from the rubble, it gave. I fell backwards onto the fiercely hot ground, the huge sign clattering at my feet. I got up shakily, stretching the tensility from my aching muscles. I could feel my face bleed again from my elevated heart rate, and I knew I had lost a dangerous amount of my blood. I would probably find a trail of it like breadcrumbs going back to the pit where I had woken up. I fumbled into the backpack for my canteen of warm water as I stood the sign on its side so as to read it. I twisted the cap off, some blood streaking on the edges, making it a bit slippery. I tilted it to my mouth to drink, until I saw what was on the sign. From what little I could read behind the damage, it read, "Welcome to Denver. Population 554,363. Elevation, 5,280 feet." It brought back a ton of memories I didn't think I had. As I looked around I saw flashes of bustling streets, busy sidewalks, windows with faces looking out, and thousands, tens of thousands of people. All of that, the skyscrapers, the bridges, and over 500,000 souls, all gone in a flash because of some unknown catastrophe. The hot wind suddenly kicked up with a heavy gust, and the sign fell onto its front, showing the backside. I saw writing, from another author. It was in spray paint, hastily scrawled, with the most atrocious grammar I've ever seen. "Welcome to the wasteland. Population, audit. Elevation, 1 mile above hell." The canteen sat on my lips, frozen in place, and my mouth was now very dry. In the reflection of the steel sign, I saw something enormous behind me. I turned around slowly, not out of pain or aching, but out of sheer awe and terror. There, on the middle of the horizon, towered a rising ball of fire and smoke, looming like a lumbering giant of destruction. It grew and grew, mushrooming into the sky, and clouds of ash blocked out the sun. The area where I had awakened had fared relatively well. Some buildings were still intact, sheltered from the thermonuclear blast by sturdier buildings which took the full force of the missile strike. I looked out into the skyline, the city center about 4 miles east of my position, and saw nothing but a huge sinkhole of buildings, machines, and bodies, all molten into a vile-smelling mix. I shook my head, my jaw slack in wonder. How had I alone survived? This was a 10-second massacre. Who knows how many innocent people were turned to ash before they even had a chance to scream for some god to save them. Then my heart jumped higher than it was made to do, and I ran for cover. Before I knew what I was doing I was hiding behind a massive chunk of concrete from a parking garage. I had heard someone moving out there. It was human. Nothing else walks with slow-sounding footsteps or is heavy enough to dislodge rubble. It grew closer and closer. I could hear a guttural grunting from a damaged or dry throat. It had to be a survivor. I cleared my throat quietly, and called out in a timid voice. "Hello? Is there someone out there?" The footsteps immediately stopped. The world had become silent again. But there was a new smell in the stench. It smelled like burning meat, like bad food. It was a scent that makes any sensible human nervous. It was the stench of death, and it was here. I shook off my anxiety, and strode out to the street again. I looked around, seeing no one, but there was too much cover for them to hide in. I planted my feet and called out again, stronger this time. Is somebody out there? Are there any survivors? There it was again, the grunting. But it had taken on a new tone, less a benign grunting like a pig slopping around. It now sounded more like a dog, giving out the quiet order to move in. I suddenly became aware of multiple sources. Now several unseen assailants were responding to the call of the first like a wolf pack. I could sense the approach of many more footsteps, the sound of gravel dislodged underfoot. It was all around me. I began to panic, and looked around for a weapon. I could now see shell casings lying everywhere, evidence of a huge but futile struggle against an enemy I had yet to face. There, leaning on the open door on a burnt-out husk of a car, was an M4A1 assault rifle. It had all the attachments and specs of the rifle standard to the United States Army, but I would have taken it if it were an age-old musket if it meant I had something to defend myself with. I rushed for it. As the sounds were so near I swear I could have touched them. I reached the car, and grabbed the gun, ready to level it on the attackers. I couldn't move the gun very far. There was a charred, bony hand reaching out of the car like a creepy decoration, clutching the barrel with an iron death grip. I yanked, and pulled, until with a sickening, dry tearing noise like the uprooting of a sapling the arm gave way, leaving the hand still attached to the barrel. I grabbed it, and broke it off, the brittle fingers snapping like twigs, and I pulled back the slide, cocking the weapon. I whirled around, ready to fight back, only to find myself dumbfounded again. There were 5 of them, all in plain sight now. They, at first glance, looked like humans, standing upright, 2 arms and legs, and a head above their shoulders. But as I stared at them with horror, I saw they were not human, not anymore. All of them were charred like burnt steaks, some of them steamed as their flesh boiled. One of them looked like a burnt puppet, all carbon black, moving with creaking joints. All of them were torn apart. There was a woman figure, most of her clothes were burnt off, and her entire front, chest, stomach, and throat, were torn to shreds as if by the teeth of a wild animal. A man crawled on the ground, both legs gone, dragging itself on a trail of its own blood and trailing guts. The others, a mix of women and men, looked more intact, but all bore signs of horrific wounds. All had flesh missing, one had the side of her neck gaping open, oozing a black gel of some kind. And worst of all, they all had strings of meat, fat and tendons stuck between their teeth, and drips of blood coming from their mouths. And in spite of their horrific mutilations, they all were moving towards me. Their eyes were blank, those that still had eyes, they had turned a milky white, unseen, dead eyes. The gun trembled in my hand, and I found I could not aim at the pitiful sights. I screamed in horror at the creatures shambling towards me. Jesus H. Christ! What's happened? What the hell happened? My words seemed to stir them up, and with louder growls, they all raised their arms towards me with the intent of grabbing me. I could only sicken myself imagining what they would do to me. I steeled my nerves, and took aim with the rifle. My finger acted of its own accord, and gunfire ripped the silence. I saw little spurts of black ooze burst from impact wounds on their chests, legs, stomachs. The weapon roared like a cornered lion, and I jammed the trigger as hard as I could. A hail of bullets tore into the abominations. I saw one take a hit right in the heart and go flailing onto his back. As I started to shoot another, out of the corner of my vision I saw him getting right back up as if I hadn't shot him at all. I was panicking, and fighting for my life, slowly retreating backwards down the leveled street. The gun finally clicked empty, and still all 5 were following me, and now several more had emerged from alleyways and from undercars to join the assault. It was a pack, slowly growing into a horde. I quickly switched the dry magazine for a fresh one from my vest, and began firing again. This time I was firing semi-auto, careful not to miss or waste ammo. I knew I was hitting them, I knew I was supposed to be wasting them, yet they shrugged off everything I gave them. They were unstoppable, and now 2 more had arrived. I was faced with a wall of the creatures, and I was running out of room, backing into a cul-de-sac with nowhere to run. Another mag empty, I was down to 2 full ones. I was desperate, and I decided on a different measure. I had to take out the heads. It's a difficult shot, and my training revolved around aiming for the widest, biggest target on the human body, the chest. But there was no other way. Reloading the rifle, looking up to see more than 20 assorted attackers, I dropped to one knee to steady my aim. I placed the red dot between the white, moon-like eyes of the closest attacker. It was the torn woman, and she looked right back at me down the sight. Why weren't these things afraid of dying? Maybe they couldn't feel fear. They weren't human anymore. I chanted this to myself as I fired, watching as the bullet flew right into the face of the woman. I saw a tiny blue hole appear in her forehead, and black, gray, and bluish matter blast out the back of the skull. She collapsed, not even twitching. She fell flat onto her back. Her fellow attackers took no notice, stepping over her as they continued to shamble in my direction. That's all it took. My dander was up, and I felt my nerves turn to steel, and I placed the next target. It was easier this time. By now I had convinced myself, these things were monsters, and I needed to kill them. They needed to die, they had to die. One by one, I popped their heads like water balloons, watching them fall back onto their own mess of bone and brains. The time blurred, I was winning, and I knew it. Finally, I dropped the 20th and last target, and I didn't even flinch as I saw it crumple to the ground, its head blown clean of its brain. I was in hunter mode, I was no longer the hunted. 20 shots, 20 kills. I felt the adrenaline surging through my once lethargic body. I was so focused on my blood-pumping victory, I did not hear something behind me. It must have crawled from under the wrecked Chevy that lay on its back behind me. I first heard it when it began to drag itself across a patch of shattered glass. Before I could turn around, I felt a grip of iron clasp around my ankle. Its legs were shredded tatters of cloth and tendons trailing behind it, and the arms were atrophied, but it was like a strong man's arm, and my legs were thrown out from beneath me. My knuckles banged against the blacktop, and my rifle went clattering to the ground beyond my reach. My head also hit the ground, and everything fogged up for a moment. I was brought back by high pressure to my toe. It felt like something was squeezing my boot with a vice. I brought my head up and looked at the afflicted foot. The crawler was still there, trying furiously to bite through the reinforced material of my left combat boot like a dog chewing a rubber ball, and it growled angrily. The material resisted its broken teeth. I jolted back into action, and tried to free my boot, but this creature had a grip like steel. I brought up my free foot, the right hand one, and pumped the heel into the thing's face. I felt a satisfying crunch as I connected with the jaw, dislocating it completely, rendering the teeth useless. I then swung back my right leg and soccer kicked my attacker full in the head. I heard a sound like breaking a thick carrot in half, and its head snapped to a certainly unnatural angle. It twitched its hands for a moment, and then went limp. Its hands relaxed their grip, and I kicked my left foot free again. Once I was on my feet, I cast my eye around for my weapon. It had gone about 10 feet from me, and I ran to grab it. Before I could get it, something wrapped itself around my waist in a tackle, and I was on the ground again. I felt fists pound my face, jolting my head back and forth. It was small, a teenager I think, and it weighed so little it was a wonder it had knocked me down at all. I returned the blow, feeling it slam into a thin cheek, and my attacker leapt away, cursing in some language I didn't understand. This got my attention. Those things I had just fought and killed, they didn't talk, and they certainly didn't back down. I looked up and saw my latest assailant in full light. Goodness, T thought, it can't have been more than 16 years old. She, for it was in fact a girl, wore a torn hoodie, and fingerless gloves and slim jeans, along with muddied Converse shoes. She now had sat down against a wall, crying her eyes out, murmuring in what, years later, I could tell was Spanish. I immediately felt terrible, although I wasn't sure why. I edged my way towards her, slowly offering my hand in peace. She wouldn't look up at me, she was still bawling like a little child. I gained the courage to lay my hand on her shoulder, and to my surprise she didn't fight me. I kneeled down, and she lifted her tear-soaked face. She was easily young enough to my daughter. She looked me right in the eye, and I again felt miserable when I saw the growing bruise on her left cheek. "Hey sorry about that," I said sheepishly. She brushed her black hair out of her eyes back into her hood and sniffled. "It's okay." I was shocked by this. I had heard her curse me in clear Spanish, and now she spoke forgivingly in English. However, I didn't mind the change. I knew no Spanish at the time. "Why'd you attack me?" She lowered her eyes at this, as if embarrassed. "I heard gunfire, and thought perhaps some soldiers were here. I ran this way, hoping to get rescued, and I saw you. Your face, it spooked me, all those bandages and all that blood. I panicked, and blindly attacked. I'm very sorry." I nodded, touching a new tender spot on my previously undamaged left cheek. "I don't imagine you'll be the last." I tried a weak smile, but the torn side of my face didn't like it. I pulled her to her feet, and having grabbed the rifle, I began walking. She followed me, staying behind me like one would behind a parent. I began to feel nervous. We were out of the cul-de-sac, and she hadn't said a word. So, clearing my dry throat, I tried to strike conversation. "What's your name?" "Ruby." It was a nice name, and I nodded. But she didn't say anything more beyond the clipped answer, so I continued. "How are you still alive?" "I was hiding in a subway tunnel from the firebomb, and waited till the flames died down. I stayed far away from the area of the missile strike. I didn't want to get sick from radiation poisoning." "You seem to know a lot about all this." She nodded nervously, and wiped her face on her sleeve. "Yeah. My dad, he's a soldier in the U.S. Army, and we all live here. We had a nice house, just down the hill." Ruby pointed down the road to her left, towards where I had woken up. From here I could see a blazing crater, and many smoldering wrecks of houses. I turned my eye away when I saw 3 burning corpses lying in the street. They looked like dead beetles. And then it all hit the fan. She finished, putting her hands in her pockets. I looked around, and agreed that it certainly had. We had been walking for about 5 minutes, when I finally asked her the biggest question on my mind. "So, what the hell happened here?" She looked at me in shock. "What? How could you not know? The military's been on the front lines of this whole thing since it happened." I reached up, tapping my bandaged skull with the rifle barrel. She looked confused, then seemed to have put 2 and 2 together. "Are you one of those guys? I thought that only happened in movies." I grinned. "Nope. Must have took one big hit to the noggin." "Yet you know how to use that?" She gestured to the rifle slung across my chest. "And how to talk?" I shrugged at this. "Dunno about the talking thing, maybe that's built in no matter what. And the gun? It's all been instinctual. Plus, I think I'm remembering stuff again." She nodded. "That's good." After another 5 minutes, the girl pointed to a large green vehicle parked carelessly in the middle of the road. It was untouched by the firebombing, as was most of this area. She ran up to it, smiled, and patted the armored skin like one does a horse. It was bigger than a car. I saw a big, mean-looking gun on top, and the front, hood and windshield were spattered with blood. I swear I saw some fingers stuck in the grill. Without taking time to look, I yanked open the door. I was bombarded by the fierce smell that one gets when they return from vacation to find rotten food in their fridge, and I recoiled, covering my mouth and shutting my eyes. Over the intense droning of flies, I could barely hear a frenzied growl. I couldn't open my eyes, but I felt 2 bony hands, creaky and putrid, lock onto my shoulders, and I felt someone pushing me onto my back. I heard Ruby scream as we tumbled. It was on me. I smelt the vile breath, and knew that if I opened my eyes I'd be greeted by something very unpleasant. So I wrestled blindly, pushing with all my might, but his hands were like handcuffs, in spite of being half-claimed by rot and maggots. How were these things so strong? I had dropped my gun, so I could use both my hands. I gave up pushing it away, and now got it around the throat, trying to break its atrophied neck. I heard it growling. It wasn't a choked noise, just angry. Suddenly, a loud bang numbed my eardrums. I heard a loud splat, and my attacker went limp, falling on top of me like a puppet, almost kissing me. I felt it expel a vile cloud of defiled air out its mouth right into mine. For the first time I could remember, I wanted to vomit, and, kicking the creature off of me, I rolled over and pasted the pavement with case 4 MRE. My stomach emptied. I kinda laughed at the stuff as it congealed in the heat. It sure looked worse than I remembered it. I turned about, to see Ruby, shaking like a leaf, holding the gun that seemed to dwarf her. She held it like I did, across the chest, barrel pointing safely downward. She looked at me, then at the dead creature whose head was oozing what little was left in the skull, and at the gun. I'm sorry. I waved her concern away, and stood up, shaking even worse than her. No, you did good, kiddo. I took the gun back, and draped the strap over the back of my neck. You used this like a pro. She nodded, and smiled a bit. Yeah, my dad taught me. He also taught me how to use his service pistol. He said they'll never expect a girl to be looking back at them behind the gun. Smart man, your dad. I gave the creature a soft kick, just to see if it would try to move. It certainly didn't. I saw it had a uniform like mine, but without all the gear, just a driver I guess. Before I could pat her on the shoulder, I heard another growl, and looked around in terror. In the minutes after the gunshot, a ring of the monsters had emerged from all directions, some of them from the undamaged houses. I saw one crawl from the ditch, 2 more crawled out of the back of a red pickup. We were ringed in. Ruby gulped, knowing that her shot had gotten a lot of unwanted attention. Oh God. I'm so sorry. I took a head count, had to be 30 of them, all groaning and growling like sick dogs. Ruby put her back to mine, and I fumbled at the side of my pant leg. Undoing a strap, I pulled a pistol from its holster and jammed it into her wrist. Here, more your size. Over the echoing chorus of growling and moaning, came a clattering roar from a machine gun, and a huge armored vehicle swung into sight, careening towards us. The creatures began to fall like wheat before a scythe, and those that endured the hail of bullets were splattered on the vehicle's front end. It came to a stop not 5 yards from us. The back end opened, and about 10 men in uniforms leapt out. 2 of them went to the still wriggling corpses and began dispatching them with headshots, but the other 8 circled us, training their weapons on me. They all wore ominous gas masks, wore thick green uniforms like mine, and were armed to the teeth. On the ground, one of them screamed through his mask. I looked down the barrels of 8 assault rifles, and felt laser pointers dancing across my chest. I put myself between them and the girl. Don't hurt her, I said calmly, slowly laying my gun on the asphalt. I kneeled down, my head held high, my hands held palms open. 2 men shouldered their firearms and dashed forward to seize me. I lowered my head, and prepared to be roused by the men in masks. Then we all were stopped by a loud gasp from behind me. The soldiers froze in place, not alerted or scared, just paused in surprise. I turned, and the girl's face had paled with shock. She pointed to my face, the left side which wasn't obscured by bandages, and reached out to touch it. She looked into my eyes, and began crying anew. And then she did something that caught me off guard. She threw her arms around me, weeping, but happily so this time. Over her sobbing, and sniffling, I heard her squeak one word. Daddy. I was floored, and hugged her back. She saw me as her dad, and yet I did not know her. 2 soldiers gently pulled her off me, and, holding me by the arms, escorted us into the back of their vehicle. It reminded me of the inside of a ribcage, with heavy cloth covering the frame. It was like a cage, yet it felt safe. It was nice and cold inside. My daughter sat across from me, between two huge soldiers with their gas masks, her eyes down as if horrified to look at me. I'm sure that, if there were a vanity mirror in the back of this armor-plated truck, I would have been too. I tried to smile, but it felt like someone stabbing thumbtacks into the bandages. All we could do was look at each other, before I was lulled to sleep by the gentle rocking of the transport. When I awoke, I wondered if I had again woken up in a different world. The truck had just stopped, and I opened my eyes as the soldiers filed out the open back end of the vehicle. My daughter went first, and then me, and I almost fell down. Overhead swept a deep, blue sky, floored on the horizon by what at first looked like clouds, all towards what remained of Denver. All around me I could see everything bursting with life. Thousands of people filed about, a quarter of them in uniforms of all kinds, a lot them like mine. I saw men and women in work suits, in casual clothes, some of them only had bedclothes and emergency blankets. And children of all ages, many of them had backpacks, they must have been in school only days ago. And the herd wasn't just made up of humans, I saw dogs zipping about, birds in cages, a lot of cows and horses. A few cats perched lazily or hunted quietly, and I swear I even saw an ox. I looked beyond the crowd, and saw a high wall made of huge metal cargo containers. Soldier and citizen alike wandered the top with guns, firing out beyond the wall occasionally. And beyond the wall stretched mountains and ridges, endless trees, and even some waterfalls. I grabbed the shirt sleeve of a man walking by. He was in a suit, like he had just come back from the office. "Hey, where the hell are we?" He put his hand on my shirt softly, and gave me a sorrowed look. "Glenwood. Everything farther east is gone, man. The eastern seaboard, the plains, everything east of the Rockies." I had no time to ask more questions before two military officers came and asked me to come with them to be decontaminated. After intensive showers and tests, details were provided to fill the blanks. Some disease had hit the country, coming from the East Coast ports and spreading inland. By the time we recognized it, it had hit half the country. Those who got the disease died, and became, apparently, the creatures that now stumbled about. Pretty sad if you ask me, the most intelligent creatures on the planet down to the two-legged equal of a bacteria. Funny statement that, they were carriers of the disease even after death, in all essence a two-legged bacteria, a bipedal virus, a mobile sickness. We had been lucky, it could have spread through the airlines, as it can only be spread by contact with infected blood. We had been able to fence it off at the mountains, to save the rest of the country. What little was left to save. Apparently, my men were deployed to Denver, where everyone was told to just stay indoors, that they'd be okay once the army arrived. But it was far worse there than the higher-ups could have guessed. I had abandoned my unit to go find my family, instead of fleeing the incoming bombs, and that had put me in the immediate area of a bomb strike. Over the course of the story, I heard words like the Denver outbreak, containment failure, and decontamination. They meant nothing to me, not that I didn't understand them, I just didn't care. I was still tired and drained from my battle for survival. I paid attention when I was told that my family, they all died when a napalm strike hit our neighborhood. Except my daughter Ruby, who hadn't been home when the bombing commenced. Yet I didn't feel anger, not at first. How cruel is it that you don't cry for your lost loved ones because you forgot them? My injury caused me to not remember them, not my wife, sons, sisters, brothers, not even my daughter. That thought is what provoked me to cry. I cried because I did not remember them. I looked out the door, seeing Ruby sitting nervously in the hall, probably waiting for me. I did smile to myself a bit. At least I had her still. I still had a chance to know my family again, to know her again. Finally I was told that, once I recovered, me and my daughter would be moved to a safe zone in Grand Junction. But before we left, I chanced to ask the doctors what had happened to me. Again, I heard a lot of terms that were meaningless, But then I heard amnesia, damage to the cerebral cortex. It was a miracle that I had survived the wound, never mind the nuclear blast. You see, one of the soldiers who had picked us up came in with my old helmet. I almost didn't recognize it. It was bent in half, with a huge crater in the side deep enough to hide a cake. It had been impaled on a steel beam hurled by the explosion, and had not the chin strap broken it would have taken my head clean off. I remember running my hand along the helmet, watching my hand disappear into the massive dent. I looked from the helmet to my daughter, sitting in a chair just outside the examination room, and chuckled to myself. A miracle indeed. Credit to Evan Dollarhide Deed. 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 If you have spent any length of time in the United States, you owe it to yourself to play the 1985 arcade classic, Paperboy. In it, you assume the role of a preteen boy tasked with completing his daily paper route. For whatever reason, your hero's beat is a particularly rough neighborhood. Its streets teem with aggressive drivers who would rather hit a cyclist than their brakes. On the sidewalks, bratty children stare kamikaze RC cars into passers-by, modern-day drone pilots in their larval form. Elsewhere, skateboarding adrenaline junkies find their greatest thrill in demolishing live obstacles like your Paperboy. In some cases, your character will be accosted by a knife-wielding madman who comes charging out of a house and pursues at tremendous speed, inevitably catching your hero and robbing him of a precious life. Taken as a whole, the game makes for an effective satire of Reagan-era America. It captures the needless paranoia of the suburbs, where people fear the harm some stranger or foreign power will inflict on them, without realizing the vanity, in all senses of the word, behind such a phobia. It shows the violence and cruelty of the average American percolating behind the facade of white picket fences and well-maintained lawns. Most importantly, it reveals how far some people will go to make a buck, or be compelled to go, for socioeconomic reasons beyond their control. It would be troubling to consider these situations if the game didn't make it all so damn funny. Odds are you will laugh too much while playing to think about many of the concerns the game raises. Perhaps it succeeds too well at its own satirical objectives. You would be forgiven for assuming that the same merry cynicism found in Paperboy would carry over to its 90s console sequel, Paperboy 2. Indeed, the second entry in the series contains every bit as much unnecessary peril, and consequent weird humor, as the first. You guide your choice of Paperboy or Papergirl through a suburban gauntlet featuring a whole new cast of memorable hostels. A hermit holed up in a motoring castle bombards you with cannon fire as you pass. Overzealous guard dogs chase you down the street. Roasting pigs, knocked off the spit by a misfired newspaper, do the same, evidently being grilled alive before your intervention, and none too happy with your interference. Runaway baby carriages, in a nod to the overpopulation worries of the modern world, mow you down if you are not attentive enough. Scarecrows, once hit with a paper, break from their stakes and ambush you, one hand raised in a fascist salute all the while. The absurdity in Paperboy 2 runs high thanks to the game's colorful cast. Although perhaps colorful is not the right word. As you play through the opening stages of Paperboy 2, you will notice one character who does not seem to belong, for he is, literally and figuratively, anything but colorful. He will first catch your eye because his palette is without color. He is the only person in the game rendered entirely in monochrome. He wears a gray sweatsuit. His neat and unremarkable hair is black. His stark-white skin, however, is especially arresting, given the more nuanced flesh tones seen everywhere else in game. His actions, too, are comparably bland. If left undisturbed, the figure in gray simply walks down his driveway, deposits a garbage can at the curb, then turns around and walks back to his house. If struck with a paper, he only freezes in his tracks. No attacks, no surprises. He is shockingly mundane in this world of cannons and mobile scarecrows. If you have some knowledge of 90s news curiosities, you might be able to excavate the unusual case of one Dennis R. from your memory banks. Assuming the national news outlets had the story straight, and reported it accordingly, Mr. R was an actuary, or some other specialist whose profession hinges on the unchallenged yet specious assumption that the future will be like the past, who woke up one night, dismembered his infant twin sons and his wife of 8 years, and brought their remains to the curb in a metal garbage can alongside all the other refuse of suburban life. The mechanical arm of the waste collection truck had not detected the can's abnormal weight, and the landfill, too, was none the wiser. It was entirely possible that nobody would have noticed the absence of Mrs. R and her children, had the local library not begun to seek compensation for a long overdue book that Mrs. R never had the chance to return. Alas, Mr. R was never properly sentenced, as he was killed in prison by other inmates before his trial could be finished. Recalling this story, you might begin to sense a resemblance between the late Mr. R and the figure in gray. Indeed, after a cursory image search for his photograph on the internet, you would be impressed by how uncanny a likeness a few pixels can produce. You might even begin to suspect that the satire of the Paperboy series is alive and well in the second installment. Here the game designers have given you a world of crime and violence and fright, and yet the most horrible thing in it is something as innocuous as a man taking out his trash. Here all the paranoid suburbanites target a kid on a bicycle, as if he or she posed any actual threat, while the real danger lurks next door. You might speculate that Paperboy 2 is a satire of complacency, where prosperity and habit inure the average American against diligence and introspection, where the idealized image of the suburb discourages its residents from looking beyond the glistening veneer of civilization, and scrutinizing themselves or others. Even you, the attentive player, were fooled. Did you think to inspect the gray figure's garbage can for pixelated limbs? Of course not. Why would you? The world you find yourself in does little to suggest that you should have. Therefore, through the inclusion of this nonchalant figure in gray, the game makes you complicit in the poisonous mindsets that suburban America incubates, a mature critique indeed for such an early video game. Yet if you were to praise the developers of Paperboy 2 for their clever stunt, not one of them would take credit for it. For none of them would admit to drawing or programming the figure in gray. In fact, none of them would remember putting him into the game. Credit to Lex Joy into the game.